So, carrying on from last week's talk about David Cronenberg's Stereo, going to move on to Crimes of the Future. And again, some source texts I'm referring to are William Beard's The Artist as Monster and Cronenberg's own words in Cronenberg on Cronenberg. Some information about that below. So Crimes of the Future, similar film, but also very different from Stereo. Crimes of the Future was released in 1970, shot in a budget of $20,000, 70 minutes, 35mm color film, and was shot, the location is University of Toronto's Massey College. Like Stereo, there's no direct sound, but in this case, the soundtrack is worth remarking upon. There are dolphin sounds and the sounds of other deep-sea creatures. Cronenberg said that he had in mind a kind of Darwin's voyage on the Beagle in sound as a sonic experience, which I think is quite fascinating because I don't think Cronenberg's films are ever just horror or science fiction in an easy or simple way. They blur the lines of those genres with things like art, cinema, and experimental cinema, but also scientific exploration. There's a real sense that these films are themselves scientific explorations, and this becomes even more evident later on in things like Videodrome, where there's a theme that cinema is part of the way that the brain evolves, or television causes the brain to evolve in a certain way, and that humans and technology are evolving together, and they're almost becoming like systems that, as they evolve together, they're not always evolving together in tandem. They sort of interfere with each other, so they influence and they create with one another and they destroy one another. So in any case, there's this aquatic soundtrack that Cronenberg thought might evoke themes of evolution. But something that is very key in thinking of the difference between Crimes of the Future and its predecessor, Stereo, is that in Crimes of the Future there's a greater sense of plot, and there's a stronger linear line from a beginning and a middle and an end. And you can actually summarize the plot. I'm not going to get into the plot here. You can look it up on IMDb and so forth. But having a strong plot means that Crimes of the Future is not nearly as anti-commercial as Stereo was, but it remains essentially an art house film and an experimental film. Now, the film is ostensibly about a disease caused by cosmetics, named after the mad scientist Anton Rouge. And as usual with Cronenberg, you get a whole host of interesting terminology going on. You get institutes like the House of Skin and the Institute for Neo-Venereal Disease, which I think are important to note that they appeared this early in his career, because they're all going to evolve later into things like the Keloid Clinic in Rabid and the Soma-Free Institute in The Brood, and Spectacular Optical and Videodrome, and Cortical Systematics and Antenna Research in Existence. This is an early genesis of that pool of institutes that seem to exist in the Cronenberg narrative world, and in particular ways, which we can talk about later. Symptoms of this disease caused by cosmetics include a kind of white effluvia that emerges from the ears and the nose of the people, which eventually leads to bleeding from the mouth. Now, part of what's going on here is not just that cosmetics are creating this disease, but somehow women, with rare exceptions, there are no women in this narrative world. If you remember in Stereo, we talked about how the vocal cords of certain patients were removed in order to stimulate or even force those patients to have telepathic powers. Well, here we have a similar kind of idea that taking something away causes evolution. But instead of the vocal cords being taken away, we have an absence of women, which seems to be forcing men to evolve towards femininity to fill that gap. But imagine, if you will, taking the yin away from the yang, and then the yang has to evolve a new yin. Well, this is never going to happen, because the attempt to try and fill that void is actually going to create an entirely new thing. So you get this kind of new sexuality, and new sexuality is of course one of the key themes throughout Cronenberg's film career. Even now with A Dangerous Method, you have an exploration of the theme of new sexuality in a historical sense, or at least the discovery of new ways of thinking of sexuality. And one thing that's not really thought about, but Freud and Jung looking at sex, they were not just identifying it. You can never just identify a thing. Part of identifying it means that they change what they're looking at. That it's a scientific cliche that the thing you observed is changed by the observation, but it's a very valid statement. So this is what's going on here in Crimes of the Future. Is there's this new sexuality emerging, and it partly has to do with the way that sexuality is being looked at. Another key theme here that we need to note is that we're looking at evolution as being treated as a kind of disease process. And I think what's important about disease, as Beard points out in The Artist as Monster, disease is linked up with desire. So I would add that you actually get four things all going together. You have science and evolution, and disease and desire. And they're all coming together into, well, I think we could draw from some interesting stuff from continental philosophy, like Derrida and Deleuze. They often speak about something called the pharmakos, which is used particularly in Deleuze as a kind of paradoxical notion that whatever serves as a cure is also always a poison, and whatever is a poison is also always a cure. And there's a concrete example in Deleuze where he asks us to think about fertilizer. And if you take fertilizer, right, and you put it in the soil, it's going to help the plant grow. But if you take that same substance and put it on the leaves of a plant, it's going to burn those leaves. And this is something like what Cronenberg is getting at. There's a plot here, but the sort of philosophical ideas that are emerging is that when you try and reframe the question of the body and the mind using an external agent like science, well, it's going to have this kind of thing that whatever is meant to cure is also going to be a poison, and whatever is meant to poison is going to cure or is going to make something grow. It's both. It's like undecidable what it is. So, and that undecidability is really, really important, because there's always this idea in the Cronenberg canon that there are things that cannot be thought. There's things that are just outside of language. They can be felt, though. They can be perceived, but there's no way of expressing them. But the human body is forced to express them. And so science is kind of lingering around this, and it has a kind of futile need to get in there, to use scientific procedures to help this along, to help change the body and try and help it evolve to this unspeakable thing. But what it then ends up doing is creating something also unspeakable. And yet, the science in a way is the good guy here. It's the good guy and the disease. It's a very paradoxical situation. What comes to mind is Nietzsche's idea of saying yes to life and having this radical acceptance of things as they are, not unlike what the self-help gurus are always talking about. But in Cronenberg, it's kind of like saying not yes to what is per se, but saying yes to the disease, saying yes to the unspeakable, and saying yes to that strange impulse that forces us towards confronting evolution and participating in evolution in the best ways that we know how. And what this outlines is this problem that we as a human species are inventing ourselves. We are self-invented, and there's something about this process of self-invention that's being driven by our biology. It's not rational to tinker in the ways that we do necessarily. We think of it as being rational. We've got a bunch of charts and diagrams and math, and we can refer to science in all kinds of ways. But is it really rational to be doing this at all? There's some drive to making us want to understand, and we do this regardless of the costs, whether we know the costs or we don't. Later in The Fly, there's a great line. Seth Brundle says, "Dive into the plasma pool," right? So that's part of what's going on in a philosophical way in Crimes of the Future. Now, all of this is really high concept, to be sure, but I think it's important because another theme that's emerging here, and what's referred to specifically in Crimes of the Future, is the idea of a creative cancer. And I think that if you watch the film and you think about this, the statement being made here is that all creative acts and the very act of artistic creation itself, whether we surrender to the process or we revolt from it, all creativity is, well, it's being treated like a kind of disease, and it's a kind of disease that's best cured by accepting it and exercising its full powers, letting it flourish. That's going to be very, very important in Shivers, which we'll talk about next time.